Hello and welcome back to the Fantasy Playmakers. What's up, guys? I just finished watching the Sunday night football game, Packers 49ers. It really looked like the 49ers were going to pull it out. It was another amazing game, but you really just cannot leave any time on the clock for Aaron Rodgers. Him and Crosby have been doing this for years, so it's almost not even a surprise anymore. But in this video, I'm going to be going through some of the top waiver wire targets going into week 4 of the NFL season. So I'm going to be going through 5 running backs, 5 wide receivers, 5 quarterbacks, 5 tight ends, and then 5 defenses that you guys should have your eyes on going into week 4. While you guys are watching this, if you're enjoying the content, please just hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and then let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. You know, it could be about this video, waiver wire pickups, it could be start sits, trade advice, anything fantasy football related. Drop that comment down below, and I'll be responding to every single comment. But let's just get right into the running backs. And keep in mind, these aren't in any specific order because certain teams are going to need different kind of pickups on their team. But these are just kind of 5 guys that you guys should be paying attention to. So we're going to start it off with Chuba Hubbard. Obviously, he's probably going to be the number 1 pickup overall just because it looks like he's going to be taking over that starting role as the Panthers running back because Christian McCaffrey is out. Good news for McCaffrey owners. It doesn't look like it's super serious. He's probably only going to be missing a few weeks. They're not even going to put him on IR, which is obviously great news. But, I mean, if you're someone who needs to fill a running back spot, maybe you've been dealing with injuries or just kind of had a poor draft at the position, Chuba Hubbard's a guy you could plug in for at least the next few weeks. Thursday night, we saw him finish with 11 rush attempts, 5 targets on a full game of production. He's probably going to be somewhere in that 13 to 15 rush attempt range, probably around like 5 or 6 targets, which is honestly enough to make him a borderline running back 2. So he probably should be the number 1 option this week. Plus, he's only owned in 11.3% of leagues, so he's most likely out there. Then the next guy is going to be Kenneth Gainwell, owned in just over 28% of leagues, and he hasn't even played in his Monday Night Football matchup, but through 2 games, he has 15 rush attempts, 6 targets. And you know, when you're kind of looking for running backs, it's going to be slim pickings, but I'm trying to find running backs who could potentially have standalone value and then kind of take over this bigger role if injuries do happen. So while you may not feel comfortable starting Gainwell, you know, going into week 3 or week 4, I think he could kind of continue to build on this role, get more involved in the receiving game, and be a potential like flex play if you are really desperate. And then if Miles Sanders goes down, I do think you can be confident that he's going to step in and be the clear number 1 out of that backfield. The third player I'm going to talk about at the running back position is going to be Giovanni Bernard. He is owned in 12.3% of leagues. And obviously, if he's injured, you know, he was kind of banged up late after his receiving touchdown, then obviously don't pick him up. But this is under the assumption that he's going to be ready for week 4. But he kind of had a slow start the first 2 weeks of the season. It didn't seem like he was super comfortable. He was recovering from an ankle injury that he was dealing with throughout camp, and he just wasn't really locked into the playbook overall. But he definitely saw a major increase in his role in week 3. He was targeted 10 times, which is crazy. And obviously a lot of that is due to game script. You know, they were trailing for the majority of the game, so they're going to have him out there as opposed to guys like Fournette and Rojo. But honestly, you know, the more weeks we see into the season, Fournette and Rojo have just been major disappointments. So I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Gio continues to see more work. They just kind of accept, you know, we're going to be a very pass-heavy team. We're going to use the weapons and our very strong position groups at the wide receiver and tight end positions. And if they're just going to rely on that passing game a ton, Giovanni Bernard is the clear top pass-catching back out of that backfield. So he's a guy you should definitely have your eye on. Then we have Latavius Murray, who's owned in a decent amount of leagues, 45.9% owned, and he really did nothing week 3. You know, the Ravens had very little success running the ball with their running backs, but he did have 7 overall carries, which led all the running backs, and there's just not going to be, you know, many top options at this position on the waiver wire. So just another guy to look out for. And then the last player here is going to be Alexander Mattison, owned in 40.7% of leagues. Obviously, if you have Dalvin Cook on your team, you probably already should have owned Alexander Mattison, especially once we saw that Dalvin Cook was questionable for the game. He ended up not playing, and Mattison absolutely balled out because he basically just took over that Cook workload. So this could really apply to a lot of these handcuff running backs. I know the idea of owning a handcuff running back can kind of be controversial in fantasy football, and I definitely understand the point of like you're just kind of wasting a roster spot. But I think if you have these clear, you know, alpha running backs, if you have a Christian McCaffrey, you should probably have Chuba Hubbard. If you have Dalvin Cook, you should have Alexander Madison. If you have a guy like Alvin Kamara, you should probably have Tony Jones. When you're kind of getting into that RB2 range, then I could understand not really having the handcuff. But when you kind of need someone to be your RB1, you should probably have your backup. So that's kind of going to apply to all the other handcuffs on the waiver wire. So just look out for that. But now let's move on to the wide receiver position. And I'm going to start it off talking about Emmanuel Sanders. He is owned in just over 23% of leagues, and he's seen 6+ targets in all 3 games of the season. You want someone who's going to be giving you some solid volume, a guy that you feel pretty confident, starting into your lineup on a week-to-week basis. And then week 3, he really just had his huge breakout, 5 receptions, 494 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. It really looked like this Bills offense started to click. And obviously, Josh Allen really likes Emmanuel Sanders as a target. So if that offense continues to cook, these receivers are going to feast. And Sanders should be a guy who is owned in more than 23% of leagues. Then the next player here is going to be Christian Kirk, and he should probably be the number 1 pickup at the wide receiver position. It's crazy that he is still only owned in 22.7% of leagues. He is averaging 17 PPR points per game. I understand the hype with Rondale Moore, but Christian Kirk is still the number 2 in that offense, and that is going to be a very solid Arizona Cardinals passing attack. Kyler Murray has been feasting, and honestly, this was a down game for that offense overall, and Christian Kirk still feasted, so he should definitely be owned in way more leagues. And another guy who should be owned in way more leagues is Tim Patrick. He is only owned in 14% of leagues, but he has scored over 12 PPR points in all 3 weeks of the season. You're just not going to be finding that kind of consistency on the waiver wire. Then I've got Hunter Renfrow, who is owned in 11% of leagues, and he has seen at least 6 targets every single game, averaging 14.1 PPR points per game. And the first few weeks, I was like, do I really want to own Hunter Renfrow? He doesn't really have that ceiling. You kind of have these other young wide receivers there, but I've kind of reached the point that I just do not trust Ruggs or Edwards. I don't think they're going to have these huge breakouts. They're going to have their games just because they are kind of big play guys. But Renfrow is the player that Derek Carr trusts. He has a great chance at being the most targeted wide receiver at the end of the season, and that is a guy who should be owned. There's not going to be many wide receiver ones on the waiver wire. The 5th and final wide receiver is going to be Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and he's kind of a guy I've had my eye on going into the season. He's someone I've picked up in some of my much larger leagues, and it really took him a few weeks to get going. Week 1, you really couldn't take anything away from that horrible Packers performance. And then week 2, he got open multiple times down the field, and Rodgers missed him like 3 or 4 times. They even mentioned on the broadcast of Sunday Night Football that Rodgers actually went and apologized to him because he did miss him so many times, but he did not miss the opportunities week 3. MVS went for 3 receptions, 59 yards, and a touchdown. He is only owned in 3.4% of leagues. If they can continue to develop that chemistry, he definitely has some big playability and could put together some monster games throughout the season. Would I trust putting him into my lineup on a week-to-week basis? Probably not, but maybe you need a big-time performance out of the flex. MVS could definitely supply you that in certain matchups. Let's move on to the tight ends, where I have Austin Hooper, who is owned in just under 50% of leagues, so he does kind of qualify here. He's averaging 8.2 PPR points per game. Obviously nothing crazy, nothing you're super excited about in your lineup, but if you're in desperate need of a tight end, he's someone who's probably not going to go out and give you a goose egg. He may not have a crazy high ceiling, but you do kind of know he is going to be involved in this offense. The next guy I have here is Dawson Knox, and he should probably be one of the top pickups at the position. He's owned in just under 15% of leagues. He has scored 8+ points every single week, and he is currently averaging 10.9 PPR points per game. He manages to stay involved in the offense, whether it's by getting just enough volume or getting into the end zone. And if I'm looking for a waiver wire tight end, I probably want them to be on a pretty solid offense because they do have that touchdown upside, and that definitely applies to Dawson Knox. Then I have Tyler Conklin here. He is owned in almost no leagues, 2.6% ownership, but he saw 8 week 3 targets. In week 3, he went for 7 receptions, 70 yards, and 1 touchdown. And overall, this Vikings kind of passing attack is very focused on a few players. You obviously have Justin Jefferson, you have Adam Thielen, you have Dalvin Cook, or today it was Alexander Madison. KJ Osborne was very involved week 1 and week 2, and then it's Tyler Conklin at the tight end position. So that's not a bad spot for Conklin to kind of stay in an offense that's been very effective so far, and there is no way he should be owned in under 10% of leagues. That is crazy, and that ownership is definitely going to shoot up this week. The next guy here is going to be Gerald Everett, owned in just over 11% of leagues, and he has scored 10 points in 2 out of 3 games. I know some of these stats may seem cherry-picked, but you kind of have to do it at the tight end position. He was the number 2 guy in targets week 3 for the Seahawks. So week 1, he got into the end zone, and I wasn't super hyped about it just because he didn't see that volume. Then week 2 was basically just a dud. But then, he goes out week 3. Obviously, it helps that Lockett was kind of banged up throughout the game, but he was number 3 in targets. If he can kind of continue to work into this offense, I think he could be a guy who starts to pick it up later in the season. And then the last tight end, he has become a staple on this list, and it's Hunter Henry, owned in 36.8% of leagues. He's basically seen an increase in targets and points every single week. I don't think that's going to continue into numbers that I feel comfortable throwing into my lineup, but just something to track. Maybe he is cutting into Jonnu Smith's work just a little bit. And Smith did kind of have a big mess up this week, tipped a ball up into the air that ended up turning into a pick 6. So maybe he can start to emerge as the tight end 1, but it's definitely something that's still a very fluid situation. Now we're on to the quarterback position, where there are honestly some really solid options here. Like if you've had a quarterback go down or just haven't played well, the waiver wire should be decently stacked for you. And the first guy I'm going to talk about, he's been on this list every single week. It's Kirk Cousins. It is crazy that this man is only owned in 32.3% of leagues. He's averaging 24.1 points per game, 8 passing touchdowns, 0 interceptions. He is lighting it up, and he has the weapons around him. So he has got to be owned in way more leagues, and I think he will be going into week 4. Derek Carr is up next here, and he barely qualifies for this list, owned in 49.2% of leagues. He's averaging 23.1 points per game, and he scored over 21 points in all 3 weeks, so he's been very consistent in that production as well. Then we've got Daniel Jones, owned in 44.7% of leagues. Week 1, balled out, 21.4 points. Then week 2, another massive game, 29.5 points. And I think a lot of people were hyped for him going into week 3, and he kind of laid off the gas a little bit, 16.5 points. But we really got to put some context on this. His wide receiver core was so banged up. Slayton and Shepard left during the game, and so that kind of leaves Galladay as the clear number 1, but he was limited going into the game with a hip injury. So, this isn't something I'm going to blame on Daniel Jones. He still showed that he had that rushing upside. He just wasn't able to get into the end zone with his arm or his legs. The fourth quarterback here is going to be Sam Darnold, and he is owned in under 10% of leagues, so a great chance he is on the waiver wire for you. And he has scored 18 plus points in all 3 weeks, averaging 21.1 points per game. This Panthers offense is looking really solid. It may take a step back with CMC out, but that also could give Sam Darnold the opportunity to throw the ball a little bit more, get some more overall volume. So just something to monitor. And then the last quarterback here is going to be Taylor Heineke. He is owned in only 3.5% of leagues, but he has really kind of given this Washington football team offense a spark. Week 2, 20 points, leads that nice comeback. Then week 3 follows it up with 21.4 points. It honestly helps him that this defense has been underperforming a ton because he does kind of have to come back. He doesn't just have to run out the clock with these running backs. So another player to keep an eye on here. And now we're moving on to 5 defenses that you guys should look into streaming next week. I'm someone who doesn't draft like a top tier defense early. I just pick up the best available options off the waiver wire. And one of those options is going to be the Colts, owned in 44.1% of leagues. They're just an overall solid unit, and they're matched up against the Dolphins. And the Dolphins weren't terrible today against the Raiders, but they did have a pick 6, which kind of padded their stats. And I just don't trust this offense with Jacoby Brissett under center. Another team to look out for to stream is the Bears defense, owned in 14% of leagues, but they're matching up against the Lions. The Lions haven't been awful, but I still don't think they're a top offensive unit, and the Bears haven't looked awful to start off the season. Then we've got the Titans, who really have not played well in week 1 or week 2, had a decent bounce back here in week 3, but they're matched up against the Jets. and the Jets have just been turnover machines. Zach Wilson has thrown a ton of interceptions. I'm not really putting that all on him because he's had no protection and he just doesn't have a lot of help around him. But if you're looking for a defense, the Titans could be an option. Then we have the Giants, owned in 7.3% of leagues. They're playing against the Saints, who also have struggled on offense. Jameis Winston, still not sold on him, so they could be a play. And then the last team is going to be the Bengals, owned in 5.3% of leagues. Put up a really nice performance today, and they're going up against the Jaguars. And Trevor Lawrence, just like Zach Wilson, has also been a turnover machine, and I have zero confidence in this Jaguars offense. So honestly, the streams at the defensive position are looking pretty good this week. So just keep your eye on all 5 of those defenses. But that is going to wrap it up for my top waiver wire targets. Thank you guys for stopping by. If you enjoy the content, please just hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Let me know your thoughts down below. Stay tuned tomorrow. I'm also going to be putting out my trade targets, the buy low, and then also my sell high players. So look out for that. Thank you again, and I'll see you guys next time.